It was July 19th, 1945, at Patience Bay, near the eastern shore of Karafuto. Commander Eugene Bennett Fluckey looked closely through the periscope's eyepiece, following the small stream of smoke rising above the mountains along the coast. The steady chugging sound of a train engine reached faintly over the water, moving soldiers and gear on the rail lines right next to the sea. Before we continue, show your support by subscribing and letting me know where you're watching from. In that very moment, while watching something no submarine leader had ever dreamed of attacking, Fluckey made a choice that would totally change the rules of fighting at sea. A submarine was getting ready to fight a train. The wildness of what he was planning should have made him stop at once. Submarines fought ships. They fired torpedoes at large groups of boats, hunted enemy destroyers, and hid deep underwater. They did not send attack teams onto enemy land to blow up train tracks. Yet here was Commander Fluckey, already the most honored submarine captain in the Pacific, watching that faraway cloud of steam and thinking the unbelievable. His crew had spent months turning the USS Barb into something new, a submarine that fired rockets at targets on land, that sneaked into harbors thought to be impossible to enter, and that survived situations that should have meant sinking. Now they would try something that did not exist in any Navy rulebook. They would become secret destroyers. The boldness of the idea stood in sharp contrast to everything submarines were built to do. The Gato-class submarine USS Barb, put into service on July 8, 1942, was 311 feet 9 inches long from front to back and weighed 1,526 tons on the surface. She carried 10 torpedo tubes, 6 in the front and 4 in the back, loaded with Mark 14 torpedoes made to sink ships. Her 4 diesel engines created 5,400 horsepower, pushing her to speeds of 20.25 knots on the surface. Underwater, electric motors moved her through the depths at 8.75 knots. She was built for sneaking, for striking from below the waves, for disappearing into the ocean. She was not built to send men paddling through enemy water in rubber boats to set off explosions on foreign ground. But Commander Fluckey had never let himself be held back by what submarines were supposed to do. The path to this impossible moment had begun 4 years earlier in the shipyards of Groton, Connecticut. The Barb was one of 77 Gato-class submarines that would be the core of America's underwater war against Japan. Her first journeys in the Atlantic and Mediterranean were quiet. 5 war patrols spent hunting enemy boats with little success. The submarine leaders recognized what many crews already knew: the Barb was capable of much more than her record showed. She needed the right leader. In April 1944, they found him. Eugene Bennett Fluckey was born in Washington, D.C. on October 5, 1913, and finished the United States Naval Academy on June 6, 1935. Before taking command of the Barb, he had worked on surface ships and led the submarine USS S-42. He went to the prospective commanding officer school in New London, Connecticut, and came out with a reputation for bold thinking that made traditional officers uneasy. At 30 years old, taking command of his second submarine on April 27, 1944, Fluckey brought something more dangerous to the Barb than any weapon: a willingness to see Navy rules as suggestions, not unbreakable limits. His crew called him Lucky Fluckey, partly for the seemingly impossible ways he got out of danger, and partly because working for him felt like winning a lottery of survival combined with spectacular success. The Barb's first patrol under Fluckey left Midway Atoll on May 21, 1944, headed for the Sea of Okhotsk. Within days, the crew understood they were serving under a different kind of leader. On May 31st, Fluckey attacked and sank the cargo ships Kodo Maru and Madras Maru in a single battle. 2 days later, he moved the Barb into ice fields to avoid deep underwater explosions, hiding among packed ice where no submarine leader had ever dared go. On June 11th, he came up to the surface to fight 2 fishing boats with deck guns then submerged to fire torpedoes and sink the fishing vessels Chihaya Maru and Toten Maru hours later. 2 days after that, he used his last 2 torpedoes to destroy a large passenger cargo ship. The Barb returned to Midway on July 5th, credited with sinking 15,472 tons of enemy ships in one patrol. The crew realized they were no longer just submariners, they were innovators. The change got faster with each patrol that followed. During the 9th patrol in August 1944, the Barb joined the USS Queenfish and USS Tunney to form a group hunting in the South China Sea. On August 31st, they gathered around a heavily guarded group of enemy ships. While the Queenfish led the attack, Flucky moved the Barb through the mess, firing torpedoes that hit a fuel ship and a freighter. Hours later, after a bird kept landing on the periscope, blocking his view, Flucky waited patiently until it flew away, then fired 3 torpedoes into the Okuni Maru, breaking the freighter in half. Days later, on September 15th and 16th, while rushing to save Allied prisoners from a Japanese transport boat hit by a torpedo, the Barb ran into an enemy group of ships. Flucky made a choice that summed up his entire way of fighting with submarines. Instead of going around the ships to reach the rescue area, he attacked. 6 torpedoes from the Barb sank the 11,700-ton fuel ship Isusa. 3 more torpedoes hit the 20,000-ton escort carrier Unyo at 0037 hours on September 17th, one of only 4 Japanese carriers sunk by American submarines during the entire war. The carrier sank that morning at about 7:55. Then Flucky continued to the rescue zone, where the Barb's crew pulled 14 British and Australian prisoners from small rafts bobbing in a typhoon-like sea, sailors taking turns diving into dangerous waters to save men who had been shipwrecked for days. But it was the 11th War Patrol, leaving Pearl Harbor on December 19, 1944, that would earn Flucky the Medal of Honor and seal the Barb's fame as the most dangerous submarine in the Pacific. The patrol began with Flucky following a Japanese convoy moving up the Chinese coast. On January 1, 1945, the Barb destroyed several small vessels with machine gun fire. A week later, on January 8th, Flucky started a 2-hour running night battle in the Formosa Strait, firing torpedoes and sinking the ships Shinyo Maru and Sano Maru. After coming back to the surface, he spotted another target, the passenger ship Ano Maru. 3 torpedoes hit the vessel, setting off an explosion so massive it could be felt 4,000 yards away. Shrapnel from the doomed ship rained down from the sky like metal hail. The Barb had hit a Japanese ammunition transport, turning night into day with the power of the blast. 2 weeks later, in the early morning of January 22nd and 23rd, Flucky made a decision that Navy experts would call practically a suicide mission. He had found more than 30 Japanese merchant ships hiding in Namoan Harbor along the Chinese coast. The harbor was a death trap surrounded by mines, shallow water, rocks, and patrolling guard ships. Navy rules ordered submarines to avoid such heavily guarded anchorages. Flucky studied the harbor's layout and announced they were going in. The attack would happen on a night with no moon, navigating through unmapped waters in total darkness, while enemy patrol boats cruised nearby. His crew trusted him completely by this point. They had seen the impossible become normal under his command. The Barb crept into Namoan Harbor in the dark hours before dawn on January 23rd at 04:02 hours, moving through water so shallow the submarine's bottom almost scraped the ground. Flucky moved around patrolling warships, placing the Barb 3,000 yards from the anchored merchant fleet. The crew carefully calculated their way out, knowing they would need to exit at top speed through mined waters while under attack. Flucky gave the order. The Barb fired 10 torpedoes quickly, 6 from the front tubes, followed immediately by all 4 back tubes as the submarine made a sharp turn. 8 torpedoes found targets, hitting 6 different ships with loud explosions. Post-war checks officially confirmed 1 sinking, though spy reports suggested 4 ships actually went down. Then chaos broke out. Patrol boats raced toward the submarine's location. Shore guns opened fire. Searchlights swept across the water. Japanese planes scrambled into the air. Flucky ordered emergency speed. The Barb's engines roared to 150% overload capacity, pushing the submarine forward at 23.5 knots, a world speed record for submarines at that time that would hold for years. The crew felt the hull shaking from the strain as deep explosions went off behind them. Patrol boats fired wildly at their location. A Japanese plane arrived overhead just as the Barb reached deeper water and quickly dove. The submarine disappeared beneath the waves with seconds to spare. For this action, for the impossible entry into Namoan Harbor, and the high-speed escape that defied every expectation of the submarine's abilities, Eugene Flucky was given the Medal of Honor. The award praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The Barb received a Presidential Unit Citation, but Flucky was not finished changing submarine warfare. He had one more patrol to command, one more chance to prove that submarines could do things no one had thought possible. The 12th Patrol would become a legend. Before leaving Pearl Harbor in June 1945, Flucky made an unusual request. He wanted rocket launchers installed on the Barb's deck. The Navy, used to Flucky's odd requests by this point, agreed. Technicians bolted a 5-inch rocket launcher to the front gun mount, able to lift to a 45-degree angle. The system could fire a dozen Mk-10 spin-stabilized rockets at the same time, each 4 feet long and topped with 10 pounds of explosives, with a range of nearly 3 miles. Flucky called them ballistic missiles, though Navy rules had no name for submarine-launched rockets. The Barb left Pearl Harbor on June 8th, carrying 72 rockets, and a commander determined to prove submarines could bombard shore bases with weapons that didn't require coming to the surface to use deck guns. The crew wondered what other new ideas Flucky had planned for this patrol. The Barb arrived in the Sea of Okhotsk on June 21st and immediately began operations unlike anything in submarine warfare history. On June 22nd, Flucky placed the submarine 1 mile off the town of Shari on Hokkaido's coast. The town of 20,000 people sat quietly, unaware, as the Barb surfaced in the dark hours before dawn at 02:30 hours, 250 yards offshore. Flucky gave the command. 12 rockets screamed from the launcher, curving through the air toward the town center. They struck factories and industrial buildings, causing damage but no major fires. The Japanese thought they were under air attack. By the time they realized what had actually happened, the Barb had submerged and slipped away. The submarine had become the first in naval history to successfully use rockets against shore targets. But Flucky's true target lay further north. For the next month, the Barb carried out a campaign of constant attacks along the Karafuto coast that showed Flucky's belief in taking the war directly to the enemy. The submarine heavily attacked the military base on Tulanai Island with regular deck guns on July 2nd, destroying buildings and starting fires. On July 5th, torpedoes from the Barb sank the Japanese merchant ship Sapporo Maru just outside Odmaru Harbor. On July 8th, deck guns sank a small tugboat in La Perouse Strait. The submarine attacked small fishing boats with gunfire, sank trawlers, and launched rocket attacks against the towns of Shikuka on July the 3rd and Shiro. Each attack followed the same pattern: surface under cover of darkness or early morning, strike with huge firepower, disappear before enemy forces could fight back. The Japanese began to fear what they called the ghost submarine that appeared without warning and vanished into the mist. Commander Flucky was clearly showing that even late in the war, even with Japan's home waters supposedly safe, American submarines could operate freely. But on July 19th, Flucky saw something that sparked an idea bolder than anything he had yet tried. Through the periscope, he watched a train moving along tracks that hugged the eastern coastline of Karafuto. The railroad ran between the towns that dotted southern Sakhalin, carrying soldiers and supplies to Japanese forces still manning defenses in preparation for an Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming. Flucky studied the land, noticing how the tracks ran close to the shore in several places. The trains operated on regular schedules. The coastline offered ways for a submarine to surface fairly close to shore without immediately being noticed. An idea began forming, one so new that no Navy rulebook covered it because no one had ever considered it possible. What if a submarine didn't just attack ships? What if it sent an attack team ashore to sabotage enemy structures? What if the USS Barb could sink a train? The crew's reaction to Flucky's idea ranged from excited to simply not believing it. Chief of the boat, Paul Golden Swish Saunders, the most experienced submariner aboard and a veteran of all 12 of the Barb's war patrols since she was commissioned, immediately volunteered. So did electrician's mate Billy R. Hatfield, whose childhood experience placing walnuts on railroad tracks to watch trains crack them open gave him an understanding key to the mission's success. Every member of the crew volunteered, but Flucky imposed strict rules. He wanted only unmarried men, thinking that if something went wrong, he didn't want to create widows. He preferred men with Boy Scout experience, figuring those who had learned land navigation and outdoor skills would have better chances of finding their way back if separated from the group. He needed men who could stay calm under extreme pressure and invent solutions to unexpected problems. From dozens of volunteers, he selected 8: Paul G. Saunders, Billy R. Hatfield, Francis Neil Sever, Lawrence W. Noland, Edward W. Klingle Smith, James E. Richard, John Marcus, and Lieutenant William M. Walker. The planning began immediately, but one critical problem threatened the entire operation. How would they set off the explosive? Originally, Flucky considered having a crewman stay hidden near the tracks to manually trigger the charge when a train approached. The risks of this plan were obvious. The saboteur would need to avoid Japanese patrols, find a hiding spot with a clear view of the tracks, wait for a train on an unknown schedule, trigger the explosion at precisely the right moment, then escape through enemy territory back to the beach where the Barb might or might not still be waiting. The chance of capture or death was unacceptably high. Then Billy Hatfield spoke up with a memory from childhood. As a boy growing up along railroad tracks, Hatfield had placed walnuts between the ties, placing them so the weight of passing trains would press down on the rails and crack the nuts open. He explained to Flucky how even the heaviest trains caused rails to sink slightly under their weight, creating predictable downward pressure between any two ties. What if they used a micro switch placed between ties, set so the natural sagging of the rail under a train's weight would close the electric circuit and set off the charge? The train would blow itself up. No one needed to stay ashore. The saboteurs could plant the explosive, return to the submarine, and let science do the rest. Flucky immediately recognized the brilliance of the solution. Hatfield not only had the idea, he had the electrical skill to build the triggering mechanism. The impossible mission suddenly became merely extremely dangerous. The Barb's crew turned into an improvised weapons development lab. Since submarines carried no shovels or picks for digging, engineers cut up steel plates from the engine room's lower floors, then bent and welded them into usable digging tools. Hatfield rigged a 55-pound demolition charge, combining a scuttling charge with 3 batteries for power, all housed inside a waterproof container. The micro-switch mechanism required careful tuning, too sensitive, and the weight of wind or animals might trigger it too early, too insensitive, and a train's weight might not set it off at all. Hatfield tested and retested the system, adjusting the tension until he was confident it would work. The crew made everything needed for the mission from materials available on the submarine, showing the same cleverness that had defined the Barb's entire service under Flucky's command. While equipment was being prepared, Flucky studied the coastal land and train schedules. For 3 nights, the barb surfaced offshore after dark, and Flucky watched the railroad through his periscope. He noted that trains passed at roughly regular times, usually carrying between 12 and 20 cars. The schedule suggested trains ran every few hours during daylight and less often at night. The coastline had several spots where the submarine could approach within 950 yards of shore without risking running aground. The beach offered a gentle slope from the waterline to the railroad embankment, approximately 400 yards inland. Trees and bushes provided cover for the approach. The land offered escape routes if the saboteurs ran into Japanese patrols. Flucky chose this location for the landing. Now they needed weather. The mission required cloud cover to hide the submarine's approach and the landing party's movements. For 4 days, the crew waited while Flucky anxiously watched the skies. Clear weather meant postponing the operation, and time was running out. The Barb's 12th patrol was scheduled to end soon, and Flucky needed to return to Midway by August 2nd. Each day of waiting increased the chances they would have to give up the mission. Then, on July 22nd, Flucky noticed thin, high clouds building above the coastal mountains. White, layered clouds began capping the peaks. A weather front was moving in, bringing the cloud cover they needed. Flucky made the decision. The mission would proceed that night. Shortly after midnight on July 23, 1945, the USS Barb surfaced 950 yards off the Carafuto coast. In the darkness, the submarine's shape could easily be mistaken for a small patrol boat or schooner, common sights in these waters. The crew quietly lowered 2 rubber rafts to the water, conscious that sound traveled far over calm seas. The 8 saboteurs climbed down from the deck, carrying the 55-pound explosive charge, the improvised digging tools, the micro-switch detonator, batteries, and weapons for self-defense. Commander Flucky had thought about giving them a dramatic, movie-style send-off, something memorable and inspiring. Instead, looking at these 8 men about to become the only American ground combat force to operate on Japanese home territory during the entire war, all he could think to say was practical advice. Boys, if you get stuck, head for Siberia, 130 miles north. Follow the mountain ranges. Good luck. The saboteurs paddled silently toward the shore, taking 25 minutes to cover the distance. As they approached the beach, they realized their navigation had been imperfect. Instead of landing on an isolated stretch of coastline, they came ashore with houses visible nearby. Fortunately, no dogs barked, though the sight of human and dog footprints in the sand alerted them that people lived in the area and posed potential danger. They pulled the rafts onto the beach and moved quickly inland, carrying their equipment and weapons. The darkness provided cover, but it also made navigation difficult. They had lost their landmarks during the approach and needed to reorient themselves to find the railroad tracks. Moving through unfamiliar land in enemy territory tested every man's courage. They crossed small streams, pushed through bushes, and climbed the bank leading toward the railroad. The weight of the explosive and equipment slowed their progress. Every sound seemed louder in the darkness, the snap of twigs underfoot, the rustle of leaves, their own breathing. They reached the railroad tracks after moving approximately 400 yards inland from the beach. Now came the critical work. Using the improvised tools, they began digging between 2 ties, carving out a hole deep enough to house the explosive charge and batteries. The ground was harder than expected, and progress was slow. Time weighed on them. Physically, they needed to complete the work, return to the beach, and paddle back to the Barb before dawn exposed them to sight. As they worked, they heard something that stopped every heart, the distant whistle of an approaching train. The sound grew louder, and suddenly they could see a headlight in the distance, growing brighter as the engine approached their position. They had not yet finished burying the explosive or setting the microswitch trigger. 8 men froze, unsure whether to give up the mission or hide, and hope the train crew didn't see them. They chose to hide, pressing themselves into bushes mere feet from the tracks as the train thundered past. The ground shook from the engine's weight. They could see Japanese soldiers in the passenger cars so close that any one of them glancing out a window at the right moment might have spotted the Americans. The train passed without incident, disappearing down the tracks. The saboteurs waited until the sound faded completely, then resumed their work with renewed urgency. They had been given a second chance and could not waste it. With the explosive charge and batteries positioned in the hole, Hatfield carefully connected the micro-switch mechanism. The device needed to sit between two ties with precise positioning so the rail's downward sag under train weight would close the circuit without premature detonation. Hatfield made the final adjustments, tested the connections one last time, then covered everything with dirt. From the surface, the disturbed earth between the ties appeared unremarkable, just another section of railroad bed, impossible to tell apart from hundreds of others stretching along the coast. The work was complete. Now they needed to leave before another train arrived or Japanese patrols discovered them. The 8 saboteurs moved quickly back toward the beach, following their route as best they could in the darkness. They found the rafts where they had left them, climbed aboard, and began paddling toward the barb's position offshore. At 0132 hours, they signaled their departure from shore. Aboard the submarine, Commander Flucky anxiously watched the shoreline through his periscope. The landing party had been ashore longer than planned. Every minute that passed increased the danger of discovery. The barb sat vulnerable on the surface, unable to dive quickly with crew members still in the water. If Japanese patrol boats or aircraft appeared, Flucky would face an impossible decision between his crew's safety and the lives of the 8 men returning from shore. He kept scanning the darkness, searching for the small rubber rafts against the black water. Then he saw them, 2 tiny shapes moving slowly across the calm surface. They were safe and returning. Relief swept through the submarine's crew, but the mission was not yet complete. They still needed to wait for a train. The saboteurs were halfway back to the submarine, paddling steadily through the darkness, when at 0147 hours they got their answer. 15 minutes after leaving the beach, they witnessed the result of their work. In the distance, a train whistle pierced the pre-dawn darkness. Through binoculars, the crew spotted a headlight approaching from the north, a train engine pulling a long string of cars toward the exact spot where Hatfield's micro-switch waited between the ties. The train grew closer, moving at standard speed, unaware of the trap ahead. Every man on the barb held his breath. The engine reached the trigger point. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the explosive charge went off with tremendous force. Commander Flucky later described the moment in his memoir, Thunder Below. The boilers of the engine blew, engine wreckage flying up some 200 feet, racing ahead of a mushroom of smoke, now white, now black. Cars piling up into and over the wall of wreckage in front, rolling off the track in a writhing, twisting maelstrom of Gordian knots. The explosion lit up the coastline like a miniature sun. Pieces of the engine flew 200 feet into the air, tumbling end over end before crashing back to earth. Train cars derailed and piled into a twisted mass of metal and wood. Secondary explosions erupted as cargo caught fire. The fireball illuminated the submarine's position clearly enough that any observer on shore could have seen them, but the Japanese were focused entirely on the catastrophic destruction of their train. The saboteurs, still paddling toward the barb, watched in awe as their improvised device worked better than expected. Flucky grabbed the intercom. All hands below deck, not absolutely needed to maneuver, the ship have permission to come topside. He didn't need to repeat the invitation. Hatches sprang open, and sailors poured onto the deck to watch the distant fireworks display. The barb had accomplished the impossible. A submarine had sunk a train. As the barb moved away from the coast toward safer waters, the magnitude of what they had achieved began to sink in. This was not just an unusual military action. It was the only ground combat operation conducted by American forces on Japanese home territory during the entire Second World War. Karafuto, the southern portion of Sakhalin Island, had been formally announced as part of Japan's Naichi, or Inner Lands, in April 1943, giving it full home island status alongside Hokkaido, Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku. While American aircraft had bombed Japanese cities and submarines had fired torpedoes at coastal ships, no other American military unit had landed personnel on Japanese sovereign territory to carry out sabotage operations. The 8 men who paddled ashore had accomplished something never done before in military history. Commander Fluckey's willingness to ignore the limits of naval rules, combined with his crew's cleverness and courage, had created a moment that would become famous in submarine warfare history. The Barb continued her patrol for another week, carrying out more rocket attacks and shore attacks. On July 24th, she launched 3 rocket barrages against factories at Shirura on Sakhalin Island. On July 25th, the submarine heavily attacked a fish processing plant at Shiri with regular deck guns, then conducted her final rocket attack against factories at Kashiho. On July 26th, the Barb attacked Shibushi on Kunashir Island, destroying a lumber mill and boatyard. She rammed and sank a trawler after setting it on fire, then captured 3 more Japanese prisoners. The aggressive campaign showed that, even in the final weeks of the war, American submarines remained fighting weapons capable of striking at will along Japan's coastline. The Barb arrived at Midway Atoll on August 2, 1945, concluding her 12th war patrol. The submarine had survived approximately 400 shells, bombs, and depth charges during her last 5 patrols under Fluckey's command, surviving narrow escapes that should have resulted in her loss. Yet she returned without a single injury. Not one member of her crew had received a Purple Heart for wounds suffered in combat during any of her patrols. Commander Fluckey was awarded his 4th Navy Cross for the 12th patrol, bringing his total honors to 1 Medal of Honor and 4 Navy Crosses, making him one of the most decorated officers in United States Navy history. The Barb received a Navy Unit Commendation for her final patrol, adding to the 4 Presidential Unit citations she had already earned. The submarine's battle flag, displayed after returning from patrol, told the story of her extraordinary service. The flag showed symbols representing each of her major achievements: 17 confirmed ship sinkings, the Presidential Unit Citation ribbons, the Medal of Honor ribbon honoring Fluckey's award, and most unusually, the silhouette of a Japanese locomotive. No other submarine in any Navy's history had ever earned the right to display a train on its battle flag. Photographers captured the 8 saboteurs at Pearl Harbor holding the battle flag, grinning at the camera, proud of their role in naval history. The image would become famous, representing not just one mission, but the entire philosophy of bold new ideas that defined submarine warfare in the Pacific. The statistics of the Barb's service under Commander Fluckey set records that showed what was possible when fighting innovation combined with technical excellence and crew dedication. During the 5 patrols Fluckey commanded from May 1944 to August 1945, the Barb was officially credited with sinking 17 enemy vessels, totaling 96,628 tons. According to the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee's post-war evaluation, this included the escort carrier Unyo, one of only 4 Japanese carriers sunk by American submarines during the entire war, along with numerous cargo ships, fuel ships, and patrol vessels. The tonnage total ranked Fluckey among the top submarine captains in terms of enemy shipping destroyed. His record was extraordinary by any measure. Beyond the numbers, the Barb's importance lay in showing how submarines could change beyond their traditional role. Fluckey proved that submarines could enter heavily defended harbors, escape at speeds previously thought impossible, launch rockets at shore bases, carry out rescue missions in combat zones, and send landing parties ashore to commit sabotage. Each of these actions challenged traditional thinking about submarine abilities. Naval rules changed to include lessons from the Barb's operations. Future submarine commanders studied Fluckey's tactics, and the bold spirit he represented became part of the submarine force culture. The Barb's legacy extended far beyond her wartime service. The submarine story did not end with the war. After fighting stopped, the Barb was placed in reserve on March 9, 1946, then officially removed from service on February 12, 1947, at New London, Connecticut. She was put back into service on December 3, 1951, and assigned to the Atlantic Fleet, working out of Key West, Florida. After being taken out of service again on February 5, 1954, she underwent Guppy conversion, the Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program that updated World War II submarines with smoother hulls and snorkels for longer underwater operations. She was put back into service on August 3, 1954, for final duty, before being permanently removed from service on December 13, 1954. Under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, the Barb was loaned to Italy and renamed Enrico Tazzoli, serving the Italian Navy until 1972, when she was sold for scrap for approximately $100,000. Admiral Fluckey later noted that, had the crew known of the sale, they would have purchased the submarine themselves and brought her back to the United States to serve as a museum ship, preserving her for future generations. Eugene Fluckey's career continued with distinction after leaving the Barb. He became an assistant to Navy Secretary James Forrestal and to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Chief of Naval Operations. He served as Commander Submarine Force Pacific Fleet from June 1964 to June 1966, overseeing the entire Pacific submarine fleet during a critical time of the Cold War. In July 1966, he became Director of Naval Intelligence, providing strategic intelligence analysis during the Vietnam War era. 2 years later, he was appointed Chief of the Military Assistance Advisory Group in Portugal, serving in that capacity until his retirement from active duty as a Rear Admiral on August 1, 1972. His post-military life reflected the same dedication to helping others that had defined his naval service. In 1974, he and his wife Marjorie started running an orphanage in Portugal, continuing that work until Marjorie's death in 1979 after 42 years of marriage. He married his second wife, Margaret, in 1980, and they continued running the orphanage together until it closed in 1982. In 1992, Fluckey published his memoir, Thunder Below. The USS Barb revolutionizes submarine warfare in World War II, providing detailed accounts of the submarine's operations and offering insights into his tactical philosophy. The book became required reading for submarine officers and Navy historians, preserving the story of the Barb's extraordinary service for future generations. Fluckey remained active in Navy affairs and submarine force reunions until his death in Annapolis, Maryland, on June 28, 2007, at age 93. He was buried at the United States Naval Academy Cemetery, joining the ranks of naval heroes who had shaped American sea power. His passing marked the end of an era, the loss of one of the last great submarine commanders from the Second World War, who had changed underwater fighting through bold new ideas and fighting genius. The 8 saboteurs who paddled ashore near Kashiho on that July night in 1945 lived the rest of their lives knowing they had taken part in something unique in military history. Paul G. Saunders, the chief of the boat, whose experience and leadership helped make the mission possible, became one of the Navy's most honored enlisted men. His awards included 2 Silver Stars, 1 Bronze Star, a Presidential Unit Citation, a Navy Unit Commendation, a letter of commendation with ribbon recognizing his heroic actions in combat, the Submarine Combat Pin, the Victory Medal, and numerous campaign ribbons. He remained proud throughout his life of his service aboard the Barb and his role in the train demolition. Billy R. Hatfield, whose childhood memory of cracking walnuts on railroad tracks provided the solution to the mission's most difficult technical challenge, never forgot the moment when his improvised micro-switch triggered the explosion that destroyed the train. The other 6 men, Francis N. Sever, Lawrence W. Noland, Edward W. Klingelsmith, James E. Richard, John Marcus, and Lieutenant William M. Walker, returned to civilian life after the war, carrying the knowledge that they had accomplished something no other American serviceman could claim. The historical importance of the train demolition operation has grown over time, as historians have recognized its unique place in World War II history. While American forces carried out many landings and ground operations across the Pacific Islands, taking territory from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, those operations occurred on islands that Japan had conquered during its expansion. The Japanese home islands remained untouched by ground operations throughout the war, with one exception. 8 men from the USS Barb paddled ashore onto Karafuto, which Japan considered an integral part of its homeland, planted explosives, and successfully destroyed enemy structures before escaping. The operation showed that even Japan's home territory was vulnerable to American military action, weakening the psychological assumption that the homeland remained safe. The strategic effect of the operation was mostly psychological rather than material. Destroying one train, even with its cargo and passengers, did not greatly affect Japan's ability to wage war in July 1945. By that point, American bombing campaigns had ruined Japanese cities, destroyed much of the nation's factory power, and cut off sea supply lines. The Japanese military was preparing for what they expected would be a massive Allied invasion of the home islands, planning to use every available resource, including civilian fighters, to resist the landing forces. One demolished train barely registered in the larger strategic picture, but the symbolic effect was deep. If American submarines could send landing parties ashore to blow up trains, what else might they do? If the coastline was vulnerable to sabotage, how many troops would Japan need to set aside for coastal defense rather than preparing for the expected invasion? The operation succeeded in creating uncertainty and forcing Japanese commanders to consider threats they had previously ignored as impossible. The timing of the operation, occurring just weeks before Japan's surrender, has led some historians to question whether it was necessary. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria, forced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender documents were signed on September 2nd in Tokyo Bay aboard the USS Missouri. Military experts have long argued whether the atomic bombs were needed to end the war, or whether Japan was already close to surrender due to regular bombing, naval blockade, and diplomatic pressure. The Barb's train demolition occurred in this context just 2 weeks before the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. Some have suggested that continuing bold submarine operations in late July 1945 unnecessarily risked American lives when the war's end was close. Others argue that until Japan actually surrendered, American forces had a duty to maintain maximum pressure through all available means. The broader history of American submarine warfare in the Pacific provides the setting for understanding the Barb's achievements. American submarines entered the war poorly equipped and held back by faulty torpedoes. The Mark 14 torpedo, which was installed on most submarines in 1941 and 1942, suffered from multiple serious problems. The magnetic exploder often went off too early or failed to go off at all. The contact exploder frequently failed to trigger upon impact. The torpedoes ran deeper than their set depth, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. These defects were not fully corrected until late 1943, costing American submariners countless lost chances and putting them at severe risk as they pushed attacks that should have sunk enemy ships but resulted only in showing their positions. Despite these difficulties, American submarines slowly ruined Japan's economy by sinking the merchant vessels that carried raw materials and finished goods between Japan and its conquered lands. The statistics of American submarine warfare show the decisive effect of underwater operations on Japan's ability to wage war. American submarines sank 1,114 Japanese vessels, including 113 merchant ships and 201 naval vessels, totaling approximately 5.32 million tons, according to the official Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee post-war evaluation. This represented roughly 55% of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost during the war. They also sank 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and numerous destroyers and submarines. This came at significant cost. The United States lost 52 submarines during the war, 51 in the Pacific and 1 in the Atlantic, the highest loss rate of any branch of the American military. Approximately 22% of American submariners who served in combat did not return, with 374 officers and 3,131 enlisted men killed, a casualty rate that exceeded even that of Marine infantry. The men who volunteered for submarine duty knew they faced extraordinary dangers in a branch of service where there was no such thing as a minor accident. A submarine could be lost with all hands due to equipment failure, enemy action, or simple misjudgment, and recovery of remains was usually impossible. The cultural effect of the Barb's train demolition has lasted in American naval tradition and popular culture. The story has been told many times in books, articles, and documentaries about submarine warfare. It appears in Naval Academy courses as an example of fighting innovation. The image of the battle flag with the train silhouette has become famous, representing the spirit of bold action that defined the American submarine force in the Pacific. In reunions and ceremonies, surviving crew members of the Barb have been honored for their service, particularly the 8 saboteurs who conducted the only ground combat operation on Japanese home territory. The story has entered submarine force culture as an example of what can be accomplished when commanders think beyond traditional limits and crews show the cleverness and courage to execute unconventional operations. Modern submarine operations have changed far beyond what Commander Fluckey and the Barb's crew could have imagined in 1945. Nuclear-powered submarines can remain submerged for months, carrying ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads or cruise missiles that can strike targets hundreds of miles inland. Submarine-launched Tomahawk missiles represent the evolution of Fluckey's rocket launchers, precision weapons that can be fired from underwater to destroy specific buildings hundreds of miles away. Modern submarines carry advanced electronics that would seem like science fiction to World War II submariners. Yet, despite all these technological advances, the basic principles that Fluckey demonstrated remain true. Bold action, fighting innovation, crew excellence, and willingness to attempt operations beyond traditional rules continue to define the most successful submarine operations. The spirit of the Barb lives on in every submarine that pushes the boundaries of what is considered possible. The fate of the 8 saboteurs and the other crew members of the Barb after the war reflected the experiences of millions of American servicemen who returned to civilian life. They had witnessed and participated in events of extraordinary historical significance. Yet most resumed normal lives, raised families, pursued careers, and rarely spoke about their wartime service except with fellow veterans who understood. The heroism and innovation that characterized their service aboard the Barb did not translate easily to civilian contexts. How do you explain to someone who has never served on a submarine what it feels like to navigate through a mined harbor at night, knowing that one wrong calculation means death for everyone aboard? How do you convey the terror and excitement of paddling through enemy waters to plant explosives on a railroad, fully aware that capture means torture and execution. Most chose not to try, keeping their experiences private, except on rare occasions when circumstances brought them together with the men who had shared those moments. The battle flag of the USS Barb remains on display at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, where visitors can see the trained silhouette and read about the submarine's extraordinary service. The flag serves as a tangible connection to a moment in history when 8 men paddled through darkness onto enemy shores to accomplish something that military rules said was impossible. Looking at that flag, visitors can imagine the scene, the submarine surfacing in hostile waters, the rubber rafts being lowered silently, the saboteurs paddling toward an uncertain fate, the anxious waiting aboard the Barb, and the spectacular explosion that announced success. The flag represents more than one mission. It symbolizes the spirit of innovation and bold action that defined American submarine warfare in the Pacific and shows what can be accomplished when leadership encourages, rather than holds back, creative thinking. The story of how one submarine's impossible raid blew up a train in Japan ultimately teaches lessons that go beyond military history. It shows that limits often exist more in assumptions than in reality. That traditional thinking about what is possible can be successfully challenged. That technical problems can be solved through cleverness when intelligent people are given freedom to innovate. And that leadership willing to take calculated risks can achieve results that conservative approaches never reach. Commander Eugene Fluckey's greatest contribution was not the tonnage he sank or even the Medal of Honor he earned. It was proving that the rule book of submarine warfare was incomplete, that submarines could do far more than doctrine specified, and that the only real limitation was imagination combined with courage. The 8 men who paddled ashore on July 23, 1945, had no way of knowing that their mission would become famous. They were simply submariners, following orders from a commander they trusted, attempting an operation that seemed barely possible, but worth trying because their commander believed it possible. When the train exploded at 01:47 hours and pieces of the engine flew 200 feet into the air, they experienced a moment of pure triumph. The impossible had become real. A submarine had sunk a train. That moment would be frozen in history, honored on battle flags, recorded in books, studied at naval schools, and remembered as proof that, with sufficient skill, courage, and innovation, even the most improbable missions can succeed. The USS Barb's greatest legacy is not found in statistics of tonnage sunk or awards earned. It lives in the inspiration provided to future generations of military personnel who face their own impossible missions and remember that there once was a submarine that sank a train. The Barb showed that submarines were not limited to attacking ships in open water. They could enter defended harbors that should have been death traps. They could launch rockets at shore installations like surface warships. They could rescue drowning prisoners in typhoon conditions. They could send men ashore to blow up trains on enemy territory. Each of these accomplishments expanded the definition of what submarines could achieve. Commander Fluckey's philosophy covered every part of the Barb's operations. He believed that submarines should take the offensive whenever possible, that risks could be calculated and managed rather than simply avoided, that crew cleverness should be encouraged rather than held back by strict rules, and that the best defense was often a bold offense that kept the enemy off balance. This philosophy produced results that spoke for themselves. The Barb sank more tonnage under Fluckey's command than most submarines achieved in their entire service lives. She conducted operations that other commanders considered impossible. She survived situations that should have resulted in her loss, and she did all of this without losing a single crew member to enemy action. The relationship between Fluckey and his crew showed the best traditions of naval leadership. He demanded excellence, but provided the tools and authority his men needed to achieve it. He took responsibility for failures and shared credit for successes. He treated his crew with respect and genuine concern for their welfare, reportedly keeping cases of beer in the enlisted showers to reward successful engagements despite regulations. His men responded with absolute loyalty and willingness to attempt missions that would have seemed suicidal under less capable leadership. They trusted Fluckey because he had proven repeatedly that his unconventional tactics worked, that his calculations of risk were accurate, and that he would get them home safely. The technical, new ideas that made the train demolition possible reflected the same creative problem-solving that defined all of the Barb's operations. Faced with the need for digging tools, the crew made them from steel plates. Confronted with the challenge of setting off an explosive without leaving someone ashore, Billy Hatfield remembered childhood experiences and adapted them into a working trigger mechanism. Required to test and tune sensitive equipment with limited resources, the crew worked through multiple attempts until they achieved the precise sensitivity needed. These solutions came not from following established procedures, but from intelligent men given the freedom to innovate and the confidence that their ideas would be seriously considered. The train mission also showed the importance of patience and timing in military operations. Fluckey spent 3 nights watching the railroad before committing to the mission. He waited 4 days for weather conditions that would provide adequate cloud cover. He selected his landing party based on careful rules designed to maximize their chances of success and minimize the consequences of failure. He planned the operation in meticulous detail while maintaining flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. This combination of thorough preparation and fighting flexibility defined Fluckey's entire approach to submarine warfare. The psychological effect of the mission extended beyond its immediate military effects. Japanese commanders who learned of the train demolition faced uncomfortable questions. If American submarines could land saboteurs who successfully destroyed structures and escaped, what other weaknesses existed along Japan's extensive coastline? How many troops would need to be pulled from defending against the expected invasion to patrol thousands of miles of shore? Could submarine-launched attackers strike at any time and place of their choosing? These questions had no satisfactory answers, and the uncertainty they created had strategic value beyond the tactical destruction of one train. The mission also represented the high point of the Barb's evolution under Fluckey's command. From a submarine with a quiet record in her first 7 patrols, the Barb changed into the most innovative and bold submarine in the Pacific Fleet. This change happened not through changes in equipment or personnel, but through leadership that encouraged rather than restricted excellence. Fluckey's willingness to attempt operations that other commanders dismissed as impossible created a culture aboard the Barb where innovation was expected and remarkable achievements became routine. The contrast between the Barb's early patrols and her performance under Fluckey highlights the decisive role of leadership in military effectiveness. The submarine herself remained largely unchanged. The basic crew skills and technical abilities were comparable. What changed was the commander's vision of what submarines could accomplish and his willingness to test the boundaries of possibility. This change suggests that many military units operate below their potential capacity not because of limits in equipment or personnel, but because of limits in imagination and willingness to take calculated risks. The story of the USS Barb and her impossible raid also serves as a reminder that military innovation often comes from those who are doing the work rather than theorists. Naval rulebooks did not suggest that submarines should attack trains. No staff college curriculum included lessons on submarine-launched ground operations. The idea came from a commander seeing a chance for attack and asking, "Why not?" rather than accepting conventional wisdom about what submarines did. This pattern of innovation driven by commanders willing to question rules has defined military change throughout history. The train mission's success proved Fluckey's entire philosophy of submarine warfare right. Critics within the submarine force had questioned some of his more aggressive tactics, suggesting that he took unnecessary risks and that his success reflected luck rather than skill. The train demolition showed that Fluckey's success came from careful calculation, thorough preparation, crew excellence, and fighting innovation rather than reckless gambling. The mission succeeded because every aspect was carefully planned and executed, from equipment making to timing to escape routes. The fact that it appeared impossible beforehand reflected limits in traditional thinking rather than genuine impossibility. The broader importance of the USS Barb's service under Eugene Fluckey extends beyond World War II submarine operations. The Barb showed principles that remain important to military operations today. Mission success depends on leadership that encourages innovation, crews trained to think creatively rather than simply follow rules, willingness to attempt operations outside established doctrine when fighting advantage justifies the risk, thorough preparation combined with flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances, and cultivation of organizational culture that expects excellence and treats remarkable achievements as attainable rather than exceptional. These principles go beyond specific technologies or fighting situations. They apply equally to nuclear submarines, surface warships, aircraft operations, ground combat, and special operations forces. The USS Barb's legacy lives on wherever military personnel push beyond traditional limits to achieve goals that initially appear impossible. Every successful special operations mission, every innovative fighting solution, every commander who questions whether rules adequately address the current situation reflects the spirit that Eugene Fluckey brought to submarine warfare in 1944 and 1945. The story of the submarine that sank a train remains compelling decades after the event because it captures basic truths about human capability and achievement. When people work together toward a common goal, when leadership encourages rather than restricts creativity, when technical problems are viewed as challenges to overcome rather than unbeatable obstacles, remarkable things become possible. The 8 men who paddled ashore onto enemy territory and successfully destroyed a train proved that courage, cleverness, and determination can accomplish missions that appear impossible beforehand. The USS Barb returned from her 12th war patrol, having changed submarine warfare in ways that would influence naval operations for decades. She proved that submarines could successfully use rockets against shore targets, a capability that evolved into modern submarine-launched cruise missiles. She showed that submarines could enter heavily defended anchorages that should have been death traps, confirming bold tactics that would be studied and copied by future submarine commanders. She showed that submarines could conduct rescue operations in combat zones, setting examples for submarine involvement in rescue and recovery missions. And she proved that submarines could send landing parties ashore to conduct sabotage operations, expanding the definition of submarine warfare beyond attacking ships at sea. Each of these innovations challenged existing rules and required convincing doubtful superior officers that unconventional operations were worth attempting. Fluckey's success in getting approval for his most daring operations reflected his trustworthiness earned through consistent success, his ability to clearly explain the fighting reasons for unconventional approaches, his proven skill in calculating and managing risk, and his track record of bringing his crew home safely despite conducting operations other commanders considered suicidal. This trustworthiness gave him freedom to attempt missions that would have been denied to less proven commanders. The relationship between innovation and trustworthiness in military organizations deserves attention. New approaches and unconventional tactics face inherent doubt in organizations built on tradition and proven procedures. Innovators must build trustworthiness through consistent success before they gain authority to attempt truly revolutionary operations. Fluckey's journey from skilled submarine commander to revolutionary fighting innovator followed this pattern. His early successes with relatively conventional operations established his trustworthiness. That trustworthiness then provided freedom to attempt more aggressive tactics, which created additional success that further enhanced his trustworthiness. This positive cycle ended in approval for operations like the train demolition that would have been rejected if proposed by commanders with less established records. The final assessment of the USS Barb's service under Eugene Fluckey must recognize both the remarkable achievements and their context within the larger Pacific submarine campaign. The Barb was one of approximately 250 submarines that served in the Pacific during World War II. While her record was extraordinary, many other submarines also achieved impressive results through bold action and fighting skill. The difference was degree rather than kind. What made the Barb exceptional was the consistency of excellence across multiple patrols, the variety of fighting new ideas successfully used, and the symbolic importance of operations like the train demolition that captured public imagination. Yet the Barb's achievements also reflected benefits that many submarines lacked. She served late enough in the war to benefit from corrected torpedoes, improved radar and electronics, refined tactics based on 3 years of combat experience, and weakened Japanese anti-submarine capabilities as their navy suffered progressive loss. Earlier submarines fought with faulty torpedoes against a more capable enemy. The Barb's record, while exceptional, was built on foundations laid by submarines that achieved less spectacular results while fighting under more difficult conditions. This context does not lessen the Barb's achievements, but rather places them in proper perspective. The submarine's success reflected the combination of Eugene Fluckey's fighting genius, exceptional crew performance, technological improvements, refined rules, and favorable strategic circumstances. Remove any of these elements, and the results would have been different. The Barb story is not just about one brilliant commander or one exceptional crew, but about the entire system of submarine warfare as it evolved to decisive effectiveness by 1945. The enduring fascination with the USS Barb and her impossible raid on a Japanese train speaks to universal themes that go beyond military history. People are drawn to stories of underdogs achieving unlikely victories, of creative problem-solving overcoming seemingly unbeatable obstacles, of courage and determination succeeding against long odds, and of teams working together to accomplish missions that individuals could never achieve alone. The Barb story contains all these elements wrapped in the dramatic context of submarine warfare during history's largest and most destructive conflict. The image of 8 men paddling through darkness toward enemy shores, carrying improvised explosives to attack a target no submarine had ever considered fighting, captures imagination in ways that statistics about tonnage sunk cannot match. The human element of the story, the fear they must have felt, the cleverness required to solve technical challenges, the split-second decision to hide rather than abort when the first train passed, the relief when the explosion confirmed their success, makes the story compelling and memorable. These men were not superhuman warriors, but ordinary sailors placed in extraordinary circumstances who rose to meet challenges through courage, skill, and teamwork. The USS Barb's legacy lasts in the submarine force culture that values bold action, fighting innovation, calculated risk-taking, and crew excellence. Every submarine commanding officer who faces a tactical decision must choose between conservative safety and bold action that involves risk but offers greater potential reward. The Barb story reminds them that the greatest achievements in submarine warfare have come from commanders willing to attempt operations that initially appeared impossible. This cultural legacy may be the Barb's most significant contribution, inspiring generations of submarine commanders to question whether rules adequately address current circumstances and to consider whether unconventional approaches might achieve better results. The story of how one submarine's impossible raid blew up a train in Japan concludes with the recognition that military excellence emerges from the combination of visionary leadership, skilled personnel, technological capability, refined rules, and favorable circumstances. The USS Barb possessed all these elements during her final 5 war patrols under Eugene Fluckey's command. The result was a record of achievement that stands among the greatest in submarine warfare history, and a legacy that continues inspiring military personnel 3/4 of a century after the events occurred. The submarine that sank a train proved that with courage, cleverness, and determination, even the most impossible missions can succeed.